morning, and welcome to this week's edition of The Scots in Us. I'm going to be talking with Alistair Bell, who is the head of the Moving Image Archives at Kelvin Hall, which is a part of the National Library for Scotland. And so, good morning. How are you, Alistair? Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Camilla. I'm very well. Thank you so much for inviting me along.
Alistair, when we think of the National Library of Scotland, and I apologise for this, we think first and foremost of Edinburgh. But I have, as I've become more aware of the work of the National Library, been fascinated by Kelvin Hall, which opened in 2016 out of a growing need and awareness because of you are in charge of everything that's recorded or written in social media and moving image or film, etc. I mean, it's a wonderful, fascinating story. So can you tell us about Kelvin Hall, how it came to be, and how you managed to undertake this huge project?
Well, thank you very much. Well, the Moving Image Archive has been in existence since the 1970s and joined the National Library in 2007. And really, since that point, there was a real growing need to kind of find a more permanent home. We were in temporary premises in the outskirts of Glasgow, still managing to do a lot of work in preserving the film and also presenting more and more of it online and to communities. But we were very aware that we needed more of a kind of public focus and a more permanent home for the work that we were doing. And fortunately, we were able to get involved in this collaborative project really at Kelvin Hall, which brought together a number of cultural heritage partners as well as sports partners into the facility at Kelvin Hall. So Kelvin Hall is a really interesting space in that it has sports facilities for members of the public in Glasgow, but it also has museum storage for Glasgow museums and the Hunterian Museum, part of University of Glasgow, as well as for our work at the National Library, where we predominantly in the space look after our moving image and sound collections there. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting space. It's been a lot of work to get there, but we are now in a position where we now have a lovely what we call the access centre available. So any member of the public can walk into our premises and get instant access to thousands and thousands of digitised films and sound recordings, as well as all of the library's digital collections, e-resources, maps, digitised maps, and all of that at the fingertips. So it's a really great resource for us to be able to really welcome people into the space and get them interacting with our collections.
When you talk about moving image and film, are you talking about a film which has a Scottish actor in it, a Scottish producer, a Scottish writer? How do you define what you put into the collection?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because the way in which we get a lot of our collections and receive a lot of our collections has kind of evolved over time. Initially, we started off as the Scottish Film Archive, where we were kind of collecting mostly the produce of the Scottish Film Council and stuff that they were funding. So we have a lot of kind of promotional and documentary films really from that era. But very early on, when the archive was set up, we started putting out adverts for members of the public to donate any film archives, any film collections that they had in their house. So we have a huge amount, and we have collected really over 40 years of that social history straight from people's houses and their home movies, their family movies, and that along with a kind of growing sense of those educational films and other films that are coming in from cultural heritage organisations all over Scotland. So we've managed to amass a collection of well over 40,000 films within our collection, really with the aim of preserving that. Now, interestingly, while we're discussing that, we are also aware of the gaps that we have. We have a really good and broad history of kind of mid-20th century and that stuff on cellulose, on film, but increasingly aware that our our video collections are representations of from the 1970s, 80s onwards, is a little bit patchier, and so we've been much more open to doing kind of projects to encourage more people to donate their videotapes and continuing that history and that social history really of Scotland's cultural life from the 1980s onwards.
But also before that, as film began and photography began to evolve, there was some wonderful early enthusiasts who were the homeowner. I was involved in a project where it turned out the school teacher was fascinated by photography in the 1920s, and apart from getting subscribing to well-known photographers, took these wonderful glass plates and all these different things that were happening, an early film. So I think it really is going to be a wonderful. Do you find that happening too, that somebody's going into their attic and find their grandfather's?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's essentially, where our collections come from, because it's often where people give a sense of value to that material that they find, which they might not necessarily have an understanding of, or they might not necessarily have something to play it back, so they can't get access to it. And that's when they tend to hopefully approach us and find out that we exist, and that's a lot of the way that we're able to kind of been able to build our collection over that long period of time. It's very difficult in the digital age where people are taking lots of digital to give them that same sense of value to it, and that's one of the jobs that we've got to do, because ultimately our digital legacy is almost as fragile as our film one as well, and being able to preserve that material rather than just have it sitting on servers until they get closed down is a big job that we're working on too.
So are you interested to hear of early photography that was done in the early part of the 20th century that maybe might be of interest to you?
It's not within our remit within the moving image and sound collections, but the wider library does have a lot of photographic collections, and we are always open to collecting any material, regardless of format, that helps to present and represent Scotland's memory and Scotland's cultural memory. And that's always been a kind of large part of what we're doing. The format makes things difficult when it comes to preserving stuff.
Yes.
But in terms of its content, we're always open for anything that really helps to represent Scotland's memory. Yeah.
So also, when I was meeting with Lucy Clements, your wonderful curator over at the library over in Edinburgh, she was speaking to me of the very first broadcastings that were done, and we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the first broadcast into Scotland. Could you tell us what that's all about and how that's leading into what you're going to be celebrating in these coming weeks and already underway?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were talking about Kelvin Hall, and one of the great things about Kelvin Hall is being able to have that space that we can invite and have events and bring the public in. And one of the programs that we're running at the moment is our Festival of Broadcasting, which is really there to commemorate and celebrate the 100th anniversary of broadcasting in Scotland. Some of your members might be aware of the work that we've done, or the work that the BBC have done in celebrating their recent 100th anniversary from the first broadcast in 1922. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those early broadcasts from England in 1922 weren't really able to be picked up very well in Scotland. So anybody with a radio set in Scotland in 1922 would probably have been quite disappointed by what they were able to receive via the radios that they had. And it wasn't until January 1923 when a small startup temporary programme came together, which was linked to the Kelvin Hall, actually, because at Kelvin Hall there was a Scottish motor show that was taking place. And in that Scottish motor show, the Daimler Motor Company were trying to market their new in-car radio, the very first cars to have in-car radios in the UK. And they'd been working with the Marconi company to put these radios into their new Daimlers. But the problem that they had was in trying to sell this car at the motor show at Kelvin Hall, big exhibition hall that it was in those days. There was no strong signal from the BBC stations down in England to be able to actually show it off. So they set up a temporary station in the Daimler company's premises, and were able to transmit a program over 11 days of the whole motor show, from 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. each night. And that was the first ever programmed broadcasts that were ever broadcast in Scotland. Just a few weeks after that temporary station was set up, the BBC opened up their first station in Glasgow on the 6th of March 1923. And then they've been broadcasting in Scotland ever since, really. And that has been, there's a really interesting kind of story around the whole radio history, and obviously with our remit and some of the sound collections that we have, as well as a lot of the partnerships that we've established over the years, we've been able to put together a little programme to help kind of celebrate 100 years of broadcasting in Scotland, specifically looking at radio, television and internet broadcasting and the influence that it's had in people's lives over 100 years in Scotland.
When was that? Was that in March that they had the Daimler broadcast?
So the first Daimler broadcast was on the 24th of January, 1923. So just the day before Burns Day. In 1923, and that was the first ever broadcast in Scotland. And then
it followed on with the BBC in March.
The BBC first broadcast was on the 6th of March 1923, so there was a break between the 11 days of this temporary station. And what they actually found was a lot of the people that had worked on putting together that temporary broadcast, because they had everything. They had music, they had news, they had a children's program, a little 15-minute children's story, and so it was really, really well thought out. And a lot of the staff moved on to work for the BBC, who had been involved in that original broadcast as well.
And so, did they put a tower up?
Yep. They put a transmitter up at their garage on Hewenden Road in Glasgow to transmit. And obviously there was a lot of people and there was a real boom in radio at that time. It's really interesting reading back the old newspapers from that era, and obviously newspaper archives is another thing you can get access to in our premises at the National Library. But it was great to be able to kind of read back to those, and they had a wireless correspondent. Because there was such a boom in radio at the time, and they referred to it as that at the time as well. I thought it was quite a modern word, talking about something being a boom, but it was very much, they talked about the radio boom. And they used different terminology. The people who had radios were called wirelessers, and people that received it, they were said to bring in the radio, and they were referred to as listeners in as well. So it's interesting the different terminology they had, just as it was very much an emerging phenomena. And it was great that obviously once the station got set up in Glasgow, everyone was able to get a much stronger signal, and they were able to get much more reputable service from what was being broadcast in Scotland. And it was very much a local programme. There was lots of Scottish music that was available, and local performers performing live, because it was all, nothing was pre-recorded, it was all live. So it's really fascinating to read back at the newspapers and get a sense of what was going on at the time, and the different shops that were popping up in Glasgow selling radio sets and everything as well. So
let's conclude our segment today with a behind the scenes look at what's been happening at Kelvin Hall. And then may I invite you back in March, so that we might have a follow on now that with the exhibit, with a focus onto the exhibit and what people can be enjoying. And so as part of our first look at Kelvin Hall, let's take a look behind the scenes. And Alistair, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
The National Library of Scotland collects, preserves and promotes access to moving images which capture Scotland and her people from the early days of filmmaking to the present day. Around 12,000 items in the collection are videotapes that will soon become inaccessible as playback devices become increasingly obsolete. If we do not act quickly, a large part of Scotland's moving image heritage will be lost. The library has over 20 videotape formats in its collection. They include 1-inch and digital Betacam used by professional television companies, U-matic and Beta SP formats used throughout the years by university and colleges for education, and Hi8 and Mini DV used by amateur movie makers. The library's moving image archive can capture and digitise 6 videotapes at the same time. The tape is captured to an uncompressed AVI digital format, and this creates around 3.4 terabytes of uncompressed data. This data is then converted to the FFV1 format, which significantly reduces the amount of data for storage without any loss of image quality. For preservation, the FFV1 data is then stored in a data archive called Scality. Its 12 servers have unlimited storage capacity, and currently we have 3 petabytes of storage. Scality has 2 copies of secured data. One is stored on servers in Glasgow and the other on servers located in Edinburgh. There is also a 3rd copy of the data stored in the cloud. Uncompressed video derivatives are also created for on-site viewing at the Kelvin Hall Visitors Centre and for viewing on the library website. We can also create DVDs or Blu-ray discs or provide online digital file downloads for the public.